I don't think anybody ever imagined that the United States would have a secret prison like this and would be torturing people and holding people indefinitely. And
April 2004, a series of horrifying images flood the internet. Prisoners being piled in human pyramids, men being forced to simulate indecent acts while naked, detainees being held on leashes, and female soldiers smiling next to corpses or enjoying group torture sessions. This is what happens to terrorists in prison.
Не мога да вам обясним то како било и како се с нама понашали. Они се нам понашали горе ник животини. Значи нису ни животини би бил толку ljudi s njima ponašali na takav način.
January 2002, Mustafa Ait Idir was handed over to American forces at a NATO base and transferred to Guantanamo, where he was subjected to brutal treatment. Idir has alleged that guards beat him while he was shackled, bending back his fingers until they broke, amongst other torture techniques. He recalls several incidents. One of the worst was when he was thrown onto this gravel path and a guard jumped on him, resulting in a stroke that left part of his face paralyzed. Idir's experience at Guantanamo was marked by severe mistreatment and trauma. He was arrested in Bosnia-Herzegovina, conspiring to bomb the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo, and was linked to allegations of involvement with terrorist organizations, more specifically, the Armed Islamic Group of Algeria. Now, the U.S. government claimed that he had associations with al-Qaeda and planned to travel to Afghanistan to meet an al-Qaeda contact at the time of his capture. Although he was acquitted shortly after that, he was kept in Guantanamo for nearly a decade.
Onda su uzeli šlaf, jedan veliki šlaf su ga ostavili mi u usta i otvorili su vode. Onda kad nisam mogu disati to, pa su ga zvali, mogu disati stvarno, samo voda ulazi u tijelo. Mimo koje su voskani, psuju i udaraju.
Idir said that he and other detainees were held in outdoor cages for weeks, while the military prison was constructed around him. He was among the first ones to get there. They endured torture, harassment, and forced feedings, all while being denied any opportunity to prove their innocence for years. It wasn't until 2008, after 6 long years of imprisonment, that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of detainees' rights to challenge their detention in federal court, leading to Idir's eventual release. He always claimed that he was an innocent man, and in the end, nothing was proved to justify his detention. He was released back to Bosnia on December 16, 2008. Reflecting on his ordeal, he described Guantanamo as the worst place in the world, a place where not even his captors were sure about the actual reasons for keeping him there.
Taliban drugo kažu Al-Qaida, pa kažu ti si terorist, ali kako svaki mi ne spomenu nešto drugo. Onda sam njima rekao ja, sad što vi kažete to zbog informacija, samo dan danas nećete čuti od mene ni jedne riječi, ni jedan odgovor.
Although detainees are usually kept under control in the facility and rigorously classified according to their level of cooperation, there have been many occasions where they have shown discomfort from within the detention camp. In 2013, over 100 detainees went on hunger strike as a way to protest this uncertain situation, and medical advisors on site established a regimen of enteral feeding, or forcing detainees to consume dietary supplements via feeding tubes. This is only one of the controversial practices carried out at Gitmo that has been properly documented at least and publicly released. However, a deeper dive into the truth beyond the camp's closed doors can only be supported by those who have left the place, as U.S. authorities consistently hide any critical information in the name of national security. June 2003, Terry Holdbrooks, an Arizona-born U.S. Army soldier, was deployed to Guantanamo Bay to work as a guard, but his work there led him to make a radical change to his life. He converted to Islam just 6 months into his development. What happened to him? How did he go from Guantanamo warden to anti-Guantanamo activist? When you walk into Camp Delta, the first thing that'll hit you, that'll overpower you and stop you in your tracks, is the smell of Camp Delta. You have 780 men from 46 different countries all around the world, sweating upon their sweat, cooking in metal cages 24 hours a day. The man who was discharged from the Army in October 2005 due to personality disorder wrote a book called Traitor, detailing his experiences at the camp and openly critiquing the treatment of detainees there. For him, the military indoctrinates their men with anti-Islam propaganda, which ultimately fuels their hate and leads to the ways things work at Guantanamo.
We had some guards that genuinely believed the propaganda that they were told and wanted to abuse the detainees and harm them. We had some guards that thought that it was best to just kill all the detainees. They were getting upset about the fact that we even had detainees. Just kill them. Why are we wasting our money on this?
For Holdbrooks, Guantanamo's a lose-lose situation. Nobody wins when going there. Not the guards, not the officers, and of course, not the detainees. Nobody leaves there happy. He explicitly recalls all kinds of abuses at Gitmo. He describes the lack of training amongst guards in corrections or even Geneva Conventions, which contribute to a culture of hostility and dehumanization toward detainees. Guards would make fun of Islam to their faces, spit in their food or drinks, and employ collective punishment to exert peer pressure for compliance. He also details the extensive use of pepper spray and various forms of religious abuse, such as intentionally tossing Qurans into toilets to provoke detainees. He remembers all the psychological torture inflicted on these poor people, which included sleep and sensory deprivation, and even threatening to harm their relatives. He would talk about positional torture through the stress positions and the use of extreme temperatures and noise as part of interrogations. Detainees were also severely humiliated by leaving them to soil themselves without any provision for a change of clothes.
Guards using detainees' heads to open doors, guards stepping on detainees' hands and feet and breaking bones, putting their heads in the toilet. It was awful. There was a lot of horrible things that I saw down there.
So if we ask the government about this, they'll reject everything. They simply say they're stories told by terrorists, defectors, or mentally unstable people. Unverified stories left for the public to judge. From inside Guantanamo, the military personnel running things seem to be well trained to avoid answering any inquiries made by the media about the real situation of the remaining detainees. To this day, all visits to Gitmo remain highly controlled and restricted. These detainees are completely isolated from the world, and their rights are lost in legal limbo.
I can't speak for what may have happened in other places or many, many years ago here, but for a long time now, there has been nothing that could be considered by anybody as torture. We do voluntary interviews.
The naval base nicknamed Gitmo covers an area of over 72 square miles on the western and eastern banks of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, consisting of 10 different camps with different levels of security and detention conditions. The base has held over 700 detainees at its peak, but some of its camps are no longer in operation, and as of now, 30 detainees remain in the camp. 11 of them have been charged with war crimes, and 16 others have been recommended for transfer, but are still held without charge.
And so it's not up to us to talk about guilt or innocent. It's our job to detain the detainees and care for them safely and humanely while they're here.
On the other hand, the absence of a clear legal process and oversight has contributed to the international perception that detainees are held outside of the law. Efforts to clarify their legal status through court rulings and legislative changes have often resulted in further confusion, with several American presidents even vowing to close the camp and end its activities, but then failed to keep their promise. But what exactly is it like to be a detainee in this place? Today's official accounts insist on selling the press the vision of a humane and orderly detention center focused on the USA's national security, providing detainees with all the necessary amenities for a dignified existence. But the few lucky ones who have left this place as free men have a very different story to tell.
يعني يستخدموا بها عملية الصرف بالكهرباء والتبول
April 2004, a series of nightmarish photos emerges from the depths of the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Unclothed prisoners stacked in human pyramids, individuals forced to mimic inappropriate acts while nude, captives restrained with leashes, and even female soldiers posing beside bodies or even participating in group torture with visible enjoyment. These pictures gained international infamy by revealing the brutal treatment of detainees deemed terrorists by U.S. military personnel. These abuses were framed in the same tone that gave birth to the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, the War on Terror. The prison, located near Baghdad, was notorious even before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, as it was used by Saddam Hussein's forces to detain and torture political prisoners. After the fall of Hussein in 2003, the U.S. military reopened Abu Ghraib as a detention facility for suspected insurgents and other individuals marked as threats to national security. But the prison quickly became synonymous with human rights violations and moral outrage. Reports of abuse began surfacing shortly after the invasion, and a full-blown scandal was inevitable. The TV show 60 Minutes, too, featured a series of graphic photographs depicting U.S. soldiers humiliating and torturing Iraqi prisoners. One particularly disturbing photo got stuck in the public eye, so to speak. It would show a hooded man standing on a box, his open arms attached to electrical wires, implicating a threat to torture him or maybe even kill him. But Ali al-Qaisi, the man under the hood, lived to tell the world about the Abu Ghraib horrors and the inhumane treatment inflicted upon those viewed as terrorists.
وعملية الصعق بالكهرباء أيضا ما أنساها لمرة كبيرة لأنه كنت أحس كأنما شراب يطلع من عيوني.
The subsequent internal investigation led by Major General Antonio Taguba revealed sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses occurring at Abu Ghraib. The report detailed numerous instances of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Detainees were regularly beaten, subjected to extreme temperatures, and forced into stress positions for prolonged periods. Interrogation techniques included humiliation tactics that violated international law, such as keeping prisoners naked in dark cells or forcing them to thank their captors for their treatment. Guards coerced male detainees into sexual acts with each other and even took photographs for their amusement. Reports would show cases of rape and other form of sexual violence against both male and female detainees.
هاي عصر المكنسة مكسورة والكسور يعني تنكسر عصر المكنسة تخانق في مكان يعني حساس في الجسم بسبب أحيانا نزيف وتداخل.
As Taguba's report highlighted, there were a series of systemic issues within the military that contributed to this level of dehumanization and abuse: inadequate personnel training, poor morale amongst the troops, and a lack of leadership oversight. However, these reasons don't seem to fully explain the extent of the military's behavior. We only need to take a look at the accounts of Abu Ghraib survivors to understand how they were treated. November 2003, several months before the scandal, Salah al-Jaili, a journalist working for Al Jazeera in Iraq, found himself in the middle of the Iraqi invasion. He was unlawfully tagged as a potential terrorist and detained by U.S. military personnel and then transferred to Abu Ghraib and was restricted in the prison's hard site, a small confined area consisting of cells and nearby interrogation rooms controlled by U.S. forces. After being moved to an open cell area, Salah was forced to remove his clothes, hooded and handcuffed to a pole overnight, forced to stay there in a painful position that caused him to vomit and suffer sleep deprivation as male and female soldiers would mock him and scream at him while beating him. Al-Jaili also described a particularly degrading incident where he was forced to wear women's underwear and threatened with furious dogs. As he was naked in a cold cell, he asked a female soldier for some clothing, to which he received red woman's underwear in return. Suhail al-Shimari, another notable survivor, went through an even harsher ordeal. He described his 2 months at Abu Ghraib as a season in hell. He was subjected to severe physical and sexual abuse. The man recounted being electrically shocked and dragged around by a rope tied around his neck as soldiers laughed and yelled obscenities at him. The horrible photos exposed to the public confirm these declarations without a doubt. But al-Qaisi, the man under the hood, remembers even more horrifying scenarios. as the majority of people taken out of Abu Ghraib were detained at military checkpoints all across Baghdad. Anyone could be detained. Anyone could be a terrorist. That's why the prison often held women and minors alike. Nobody was safe from the horror. There's at least one proven instance of a detainee being tortured to death, and survivors who recall hearing the agonizing screams of women being raped every night. All these women would go silent after the atrocities were exposed.
يعني اغتصبوها أمامك. أو
October 31st, 2003, another survivor, Talib al-Majili, who'd spent 16 months at Abu Ghraib, expressed the lasting psychological impact of his experiences. He stated that the time he spent in the prison ended his life, leaving him feeling like only half a human due to the trauma he'd suffered. His struggle continued long after his release, as he faced difficulty in finding employment and rebuilding his life. It seemed to be a constant among survivors once considered and treated as terrorists. Deep psychological scars persist decades after their ordeals.
I was arrested. They put a hood over my head and zip ties, not metal handcuffs, plastic zip ties. They loaded me into a Humvee vehicle. They took me to Abu Ghraib prison. They took my photo, scanned my iris, and fingerprinted me. They questioned me. They took away our clothes. They mocked us while we were blindfolded with hoods over our heads. We were completely powerless. They piled us prisoners on top of each other. A tragedy, really. For 1 year and 4 months.
لحد الآن والله يعني أنا مرات منعيد شريط بذاكرتي وأتذكر قلت لك يعني توصل بي مرحلة انتحار والله.
The horrifying events that took place at Abu Ghraib severely tarnished the reputation of the U.S. military domestically and internationally. For many in the Arab world, it became emblematic of American imperialism and hypocrisy regarding human rights. The U.S. government consistently denies this modus operandi. However, the images from Abu Ghraib fueled anti-American sentiment and were used by extremist groups to recruit members, thus reinforcing the same terrorist groups they were trying to eradicate. U.S. officials claim that these abuses were isolated incidents perpetrated by a few soldiers rather than reflective of military policy or practice. But you know what? Human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch point out that similar abuses have been reported in other detention facilities across Iraq and Afghanistan before Abu Ghraib became public knowledge, which seems to establish a disturbing operational pattern.
التعذيب أنا أقول لك تعذيب كلاب بوليسية رمان صوتي ورمي حي ومي بالزنزانات.
Think about this. None of these survivors were ever charged with any crimes, really showing the arbitrary nature of their detention and the systemic failure that allowed such abuses to occur. Even more sadly, estimations show that around 70 to 90% of the detainees were imprisoned by mistake. Every one of them suffers from psychological issues to this day, 2 decades after the Abu Ghraib horror. They often describe feelings of deep humiliation and degradation, which lead to chronic anxiety, depression, and PTSD. The psychological impact of being subjected to torture, sexual humiliation, and a constant threat of violence really creates a perpetual sense of fear and helplessness in those who were treated as terrorists.
يعني أنا لحد الآن الحمام مالي ما أقدر أشوف بيه البانيو من أشوفه أتذكر الإيهام بالغرق.
Cuando pasa al penal, él ya no tiene derecho a visitas. El trato es totalmente diferente, ya no tiene aquellos privilegios que antes, ¿verdad? Gozaban de llevarles prostitutas y todo. March
2022. The Salvadoran government classifies the criminal groups known as Maras, including notorious gangs like Barrio 18 and MS-13, as full-fledged terrorist organizations. This designation reflects their extensive involvement in violent crimes such as murder, extortion, and drug trafficking, which have really terrorized communities across the Central American country. Under President Nayib Bukele's administration, this classification has been solidified through aggressive policies aimed at dismantling these gangs and their influence. The Terrorism Confinement Center, or CCOT, is the main consequence of this classification, as it was explicitly named to reflect President Bukele's view of gang members as terrorists, an approach that underscores the government's commitment to combating gang-related violence and restoring order in a nation long plagued by their criminal activities since at least the 1980s. A 100 inmates in a common cell sleep on a metal plank bunk bed without any sheets or pillows. The former members of the most powerful street gangs in El Salvador are now forced to share a cell and a toilet with their previous enemies. And those gang tattoos mean absolutely nothing within the confines of CCOT. Even those famous gang signs are systematically obliterated. Anyone seen trying to display them is guaranteed to receive some time in a harsher cell under a solitary confinement regimen. This is how terrorists are treated in El Salvador's prisons. For decades, Salvadoran gangs, particularly Barrio 18 and MS-13, controlled neighborhoods through violence, kidnapping, murder, trafficking, and extortion. These gangs made their names synonymous with terror and lawlessness. However, that aggressive campaign initiated by President Nayib Bukele in March 2022 has significantly weakened these gangs. More than 66,000 alleged gang members have been imprisoned, forcing those who remain free to either go underground or abandon the country completely. Despite this massive crackdown, though, Barrio 18 remains a criminal threat due to its scattered members across Central America and even the US. Either way, the remaining domestic terrorists are being hunted like rats, quite literally, hiding in sewers and water tanks as they try to avoid the nationwide military and police deployment.
Un pandillero intentó ocultarse dentro de una pila llena de agua, pero no soportó la respiración y debió salir a tomar aire. Fue entonces que las autoridades lo pescaron.
You see, before Bukele's presidency began on June 1st, 2019, incarcerated gang members enjoyed an absurd number of privileges in El Salvador's prisons. They would have their conjugal visits and could communicate with anybody from the outside world. Authorities turned a blind eye to their activities, allowing them to continue leading their criminal organizations. They would have mass weddings here, where gang members married their partners who frequently visited them. They would even film rap concerts while enjoying amenities like drugs and alcohol. But then President Bukele came around, and new measures were set to isolate the Maras completely. This included cutting off their communications with the outside world by installing a modern signal blocking system and even confiscating all electronic devices from prisoners who shouldn't even have it in the first place. Today, the remaining terrorists or gang members out in the wild are hunted down by the army using reconnaissance drones, infrared scanners, and other state-of-the-art technologies.
Van a tener nada más dos caminos. O se mueren en la montaña de hambre o se entregan a la justicia.
CCOT had marked a pivotal moment in Bukele's war against drugs. This max security facility was built from scratch, isolated from urban centers, spanning 236 acres, and designed to hold up to 40,000 inmates. CCOT's heavily guarded by military personnel and monitored by hundreds of cameras. Life inside this place is a little different from the previous prison conditions. Inmates are now housed in overcrowded cells with minimal space, approximately 6.23 square feet per person, far below international standards. They sleep on these metal bunk beds without mattresses or bedding and share open toilets with little to no privacy. They're constantly under surveillance, ensuring that every movement is recorded. Guards maintain strict control over inmate behavior. This isolation aims to dismantle gang structure and eliminate command chains. Now, disciplinary measures within CCOT are harsh but humane. For instance, inmates facing solitary for rule violations are placed in stark cells, containing only a cement slab and a toilet. The bright lighting inside contributes to an oppressive environment where inmates lose track of time. Now, they may treat these modern-day terrorists with a small amount of consideration for their human rights, but they're still provided with access to legal counseling and procedures, official criminal charges and investigations in each individual case, and even due process to establish their sentences. Despite the significant drop in crime rates, reportedly down to 0.4 deaths from violence per day, human rights organizations have raised concerns about the treatments of prisoners in CCOT. Critics argue that while public safety is essential, it shouldn't come at the cost of fundamental human rights. NGOs and human rights organizations talk about the lack of transparency regarding living conditions inside CCOT. They say access to media and legal representatives are severely restricted, raising concern about accountability within the prison system. In February 2023, President Bukele announced a significant move: the relocation of thousands of high-ranking gang members to CCOT as part of his aggressive campaign against gangs. The mega prison stands as a symbol of this campaign, but also raises questions about overcrowding and living conditions. At full capacity, each cell module can hold 80 to 100 prisoners. However, if it's at that point, they only have mere inches of space between them, far below the international standards recommended by organizations like the Red Cross. While authorities claim they have transferred thousands of prisoners to CCOT, its capacity extends to an astonishing 40,000 inmates.
Les criminels dorment dans un système de couchettes à 4 niveaux, sans matelas, et une fois qu'ils sont entrés ici, ils n'en sortent pas avant d'avoir purgé leur peine.
Inside CCOT, life is designed to strip inmates of their identities and privileges entirely. There's no recreational activity or form of entertainment. Daily routines are monotonous and strictly regulated by prison authorities. Inmates eat the same bland food served on a metal tray without any option for variety or choice. The oppressive atmosphere created by the buzzing bright lights doesn't let inmates escape their surroundings or even find solace in the darkness. Their outfits are plain white, and this lack of color symbolizes their loss of identity within these walls. Cell extractions are conducted daily under complete scrutiny. This is when prisoners can enjoy some physical exercise, but only within designated areas surrounded by guards who ensure no escape is possible. Let's say someone needs medical attention or legal representation. Everything happens remotely via video calls. And as of today, you can't argue the results.
Pandillas y aseguró que su país ya acumuló 365 días sin homicidios desde que inició su mandato en 2019.
February 2024. El Salvador celebrated a significant milestone in its fight against gang violence, reaching 1 year without homicides. Today, the milestone keeps growing and becomes even more impressive. The country has reached over 600 days without homicides. Guys, that's insane. This is all due to Bukele's aggressive campaign against gang violence, with his CCOT center as the protagonist, just fueling the significant drop in crime rate. The next step for El Salvador is to get these prisoners to work on cleaning, construction projects, and other laborious tasks. This approach aims to utilize the labor of formerly destructive terrorist manpower productively. Bukele's going to force these individuals to rebuild the country they helped destroy for so long. This innovative measure is part of the Zero Leisure Plan. Every day, 3,000 inmates are sent out to carry out various productive tasks around wherever. And this is the best way for them to reintegrate into society, through honest work. Terrorists have been forced to trade their guns and knives for wheelbarrows, brooms, and even garbage bags. For instance, in preparation for the Central American and Caribbean Games mid-year, 500 convicts were sent to work on the construction of new stadiums and sports tracks. Meanwhile, in women's prisons, uniforms were made for young athletes in sports academies. You see, in this way, inmates are covering their living costs while learning to contribute productively to the country. Seeing former criminals working for their fellow citizens really injects hope into the Salvadoran society. But how exactly does this Zero Leisure Plan work? So, inmates who demonstrate exemplary behavior enter this trust phase, allowing them to go out in shifts, first for 4 hours, and then for 8 hours. They're sent to the poorest areas of the country to assist with cleaning tasks, always under strict military surveillance, though. And as a reward, every day they work counts as a day deducted from their sentence, meaning that the more work they do, the sooner they're getting out of there. And rather than complaining, inmates are often the first to express joy at being able to contribute to society. And within weeks, they become accustomed to honest work and maybe think twice about crime.
Así es. Los antiguos pandilleros rehabilitados son la nueva fuerza laboral del país. Y de esta manera empiezan a reparar el daño causado a la sociedad.